everyone. My name is Seth. I'm the practice manager for the Urban and Disaster Risk Management program of the World Bank in the East Asia region. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone for this 30th edition of the Cities on the Frontline speaker series. Today we will explore the topic of resilient leadership in time of crisis. Lauren will actually introduce the topic and our four speakers in a minute, but first it's my honor to remind everyone of the intention of this speaker series and the ground rule for today's conversation. The purpose of the speaker series is to have an open and honest learning conversation between practitioners in cities and government and partners supporting those entities. The webinars are not on the record, so we ask that you not attribute any comments made today or question asked to the speakers unless the material are made available after the call or you have the person's express permission to do so. We have close to 200 participants registered, so we ask that you ask your question in the Q&A section of the WebEx. You can find it by moving your mouse and you see the Q&A button appear. And before anybody asks, please note that the recording of this session, as well as the PowerPoint presentation, will be posted online next Monday. Lauren, over to you.
Thank you, Francis. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Swerkin, the Executive Director of Resilient Cities Network. And it's quite amazing to reflect on this session that this is the 30th time you've done this. And as you do something over and over, say you do something 30 times or many more, supposedly you learn something and you get better at it and you build a muscle. And in that same vein, and to recite the old adage, not to let any crisis go to waste, towards the beginning of this pandemic, for 16 weeks, the Resilient Shift partnered with us at the Resilient Cities Network to bring together very diverse senior leaders from corporations, from the World Bank, and chief resilience officers from 5 regions of the world to take part in a really experimental program of weekly reflective conversations. And they were following not only the professional, but also the personal journeys of these leaders. And they generated real-time insights and observations that were then posted for other leaders to access and learn from, in the intention of creating lessons for leadership that will inevitably deal with other crises in the future. And so tonight's session is about sharing this really rich information with all of you. And we're thrilled to have 4 panelists who I'm very proud to call colleagues and friends, who were forming an integral part of this work. So let me introduce them each very briefly. First, we have Elaine Roberts, who for the past 20 years has held a number of transformational roles at companies from Vodafone to Motorola before she joined Lloyd's Register, where she's now the Chief Marketing Officer, and she drives digital transformation. She also serves on the Lloyd's Register Foundation Resilient Shift Program's Board of Directors. We also have Craig Kesson, who is here from one of our member cities, the city of Cape Town, and he has been in various roles there for over a decade. He was made an executive director the same year in 2017 that he became Chief Resilience Officer. And he has also recently, because that wasn't enough responsibility for his level of capability, taken on the role of Chief Data Officer. And he was also one of the leaders of the city's water resilience task team. And I hope we'll get a chance to talk about that as well, Craig. It's next my pleasure to introduce Peter Willis. Peter's originally from the UK. Hopefully he'll get his camera on in the next few minutes, but if not, you'll hear his very resonant voice. He is a renowned lecturer and he facilitates and advises about issues of sustainability. He was previously the Africa Director of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. And he has one of the most amazing jobs I've ever heard of. And that is that he facilitates strategic conversations about crises, about learning processes, and we'll hear more about that in just a minute. And then Last but certainly not least, Seth Schultz, who is the Executive Director of the Resilience Shift. The Resilience Shift, for those of you who aren't familiar, exists to make the world safer through resilient infrastructure, and Seth has long worked in the field of consensus building and initiating change around climate, sustainable development, and urban resilience. So we're really thrilled to have all four of these speakers with us tonight. Now I'm going to turn it back over to Francis to kick us off with a few questions.
Thank you, Lauren, and let's get going. Peter and Seth, let me start with the two of you to set the context of this project, of this journey, the why, the what, the how. And maybe starting with you, Seth, you're the Executive Director of the Resilience Shift, and you've been involved from the start. So can you tell us why this experiment in reflective learning, and how did it come off the ground? Literally, how did you get started on this journey?
Yeah, thanks, Francis, and thanks for the intro, Lauren, and for hosting us today. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, because I think, like many people, when the pandemic started really truly sweeping around the globe, we were faced with the similar questions everybody was. You know, do we slow down our operations? How are we protecting our workforce? What are we going to do for our funders? But I think in our case, we felt it kind of an even more deeply profound issue or problem, which is that the Resilient Shift, one of the main things we work on is raising the awareness of the importance of resilience and the infrastructure we rely on. So we kind of had this like moment of self-crisis, to be honest. Like, we can't kind of curl up and hide in this thing. We've got to try to figure out how to help everybody, but how is a small NGO going to do that? So we kind of put everything aside, had a couple of internal kind of team meetings, put everything on the table. You know, what could we do here? What would be meaningful? And what's interesting, Francis, is that I think a lot of personal kind of experiences and emotions came through in helping us select what we did. And that was very much the case for my part. You know, so before working in the NGO community, I was a consultant at big engineering firms, and I worked at a lot on recovery, emergency response, and hazardous waste. So my personal experiences from responding to 9/11 for 6 months, from working down in Hurricane Katrina after the hurricanes, the earthquakes in Haiti, you know. No, you can never be totally prepared for that level of intensity and trauma and response. And when you're in it, you're just focused on it 24/7. And my reflections is that after that, I almost had a hard time kind of jumbling together the sequence of things, what I felt, what I did, what other people felt versus the public perception of what was happening in that time frame. But I learned, you know, to Lauren's point, you know, no crisis goes unused. It was incredible learning opportunities for me, and ones that I'm still drawing upon. So our thought was, you know, how can we do justice to people who are in the eye of the storm, literally now? How can we help them? In what way can we help them? But also not to be too bound by that, too kind of top down to this is what you should be doing. Because in many instances, there isn't necessarily thou shall not. So we kind of came up with a process that we could perhaps draw on. And then there's the other component of this, which is, I think, the side that Peter might tell, because we had done a project with Peter in Cape Town, also that Craig had been involved in, that really also helped shape some experiences, which was the powerful ability of listening to others' experiences and what they're happening. So less like an expert is going to tell you, more I am this person and I went on this journey and this is what happened to me. And that project that we did on day zero in Cape Town was unbelievably moving for us, and one of the kind of most important things we've done in the last 3 years. So we were kind of figuring, how can we do something that captures that ethos of listening while also being there in real time for people who are struggling with this. And then I think the last thing that just because I'm a little bit of a geek, I think the other thing that was quite interesting was to try to compare different geographies, because what happened with COVID is a slow onset crisis. So unlike the things that I mentioned, which is a terrorist attack, a hurricane, an earthquake, intense, acute issues that you have to deal with, this was a slow onset kind of crisis and disaster. And the issue was the same. What manifested itself was different depending on when it hit, how severely it hit, and how prepared you were when it hit, depending on where in the world you were. So the idea, we knew we wanted to play with geographies, different parts of the world with different underlying conditions. And then we also thought, wouldn't it be cool if we looked at different types of impacts? So companies from shareholders and business continuity versus cities with citizens and government. So those are the kind of the ingredients, but maybe I think we'll hear from Peter on his perspectives and what his influence was in the genesis of this project.
Thank you very much. So very interesting. So learning while the crisis is unfolding rather than wait to kind of do the usual post-mortem. I'm sure that the conversation today will be quite interesting. Peter, let me turn to you. You're the lead really in this project. You did literally all the interviews. You work with the project team. You distill the insights and the output every single week. Can you share a little bit about that part of the journey? How did it unfold and kind of what you learned along the way that you think is different than what you would have learned in a post-mortem?
Yes, thank you, Francis, and thank you, Lauren, and lovely to be with you, Craig, and Elaine, and Seth again. And my apologies, I think it's the CIA or it's KGB or whoever they are these days have gone and switched off my camera. They're obviously afraid I'm more powerful than I thought. So I'm afraid you're not going to get me in live video, but I have got one or two slides to share with you. So I'm going to, and I decided to, because our camera won't work, you're going to see, that's a still photo of me. And so let's get into the slides. So Seth has beautifully framed the twin intentions we had here, and this partnership that we this word spontaneous is really important because everything happened. This entire project was set up, a collaboration between two large sort of nonprofits and covering 8 continents, was set up in 2 weeks from start to finish. So that's why I call it a spontaneous collaboration. And it was to help. As Seth said, we wanted to get alongside these leaders while they were in the eye of the storm, and at the same time learn from them so that we weren't sure how, but we assumed we would learn from them in a way that we could share that with other leaders. So this is what, it worked for 4 months, beginning of April through to the end of July. I don't know, we just came up with that figure of 16 weeks, and I think it was probably about right. We identified 12 leaders. There are their photos. You can see Craig top right and Elaine and third from the left in the middle row. And they were, as Lauren has said, 5 of them were chief resilience officers on 5 different continents, 5 big cities, and 7 of them were senior corporate executives also around the world from 8 different countries. And every week I would have a half-hour Zoom conversation with each of them. And it's important to tell you that the agenda for those conversations was always open. There was never a list of questions that I needed them to answer so that I could tick them off and add them to a research pool. This was a much more organic set of conversations, and I think that was really important in determining what emerged. And outputs, each week of the week's 12 conversations, I would pull together with this amazing little team of 4, 2 in Cape Town, 2 in London, who helped throughout. We would pull together a summary of insights, just 4 pages of the best insights, and we would share those only with the 12 participants so that they felt they were part of a community that was moving through this together. Even though we didn't have meetings between them until right at the end, they could see what each other was thinking and experiencing because of these weekly summaries. Then the following week, beginning of the following week, we would produce a blog post. Femke Goebbels from the Resilient Cities Network would draft that, and then we had one of the other members of the team did a new drawing every week, encapsulating some of the most interesting insights you can see there on the right. And then, Seth and I, usually on the Tuesday, would get on Zoom together, he in New York, me in Cape Town, and he would basically ask me, okay, Peter, what happened last week? What did they say? And what have we learned? And because of his depth of experience and what I was bringing from these conversations, we would have a really, well, to us at least, we thought it was quite an interesting conversation, and we would put that on the website as a podcast. And in the end, we had 37 separate, discrete leadership insights, and backed up by 120 plus supporting quotes from the participants. It's an incredibly rich panoply of insights and wisdom coming from the eye of the storm. And we put all of this together into the final report. You can see that's the little black covered document on the right there. And yeah, so that was essentially it. And that's where it all sits. I'll leave that for a moment, but I think you probably can get that from the comment section, or I'll drop it in there. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand back to Francis. Yeah? Francis, do you want to be handed back to?
I will pass the baton to Lauren, I think, who's going to continue the conversation.
That's right. And I think for those of you who haven't seen those materials that Peter was just displaying, it is really worth looking at the website, because the information and the way it's distilled is very easy to use and to digest and really meaningful. But I want to turn the word over right now to Elaine and to Craig. And I have a similar question for both of you. You know, there have been throughout the interviews frequent discussions about the fact that with this extreme disruption comes an opportunity for transformation. And has that really materialized? Has this continued and protracted disruption really changed your approach as a leader? Has it changed your approach as a manager? And I'm going to give Elaine, ladies first right of reply on that.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Thank you for inviting me along today. I think about that question, I'm not sure that my overall approach has changed, but what it has done is really heighten my sense of awareness of the responsibility and privilege of leadership. And it's made me think about, I've been fortunate enough across my career, and Lauren, you didn't mention it in the opening, but not your problem, but I spent 12 years in the military before starting in corporate life, and we might come back to that as some of these ideas develop. I found myself thinking about all the leadership programs that had been on, and almost all those elements, the things that you're supposed to do, the things that you might have forgotten, have come back into play. And I'm thinking about, am I taking care of those as a leader? So I don't think my approach changed, but probably my awareness has changed. It's like everything's come into sharp focus. And I think one thing that really strikes me is through this time is probably a sense of focus, brutal focus, if you like. I think many companies, and I've worked in several, we always have so many ideas and we have so many projects that we're getting on with. And a time like this in the pandemic forces you to really think about what's important. And when I think about that, I found myself thinking about being a leader, probably a leader in three different ways. I'm a leader of the business. I'm part of the executive team of a company. I'm a leader of a function, team, and people, you know, in sort of line reporting sense. And then I think the other one that's often forgotten is I'm a leader of myself, and how do you take care of yourself through all of this? And so if we think about that focus maybe, and how you think about being a leader of a business, what needs to be done? Why does it need to be done? How are you doing it? How do we focus? I mean, Simon Sinek would always say, start with the why. Start with the why and you get there. And I think that links back to your question about transformation. Why are you doing something, and what is the importance of it? And that can lead, just asking that simple question could often lead to very, very different outcomes. So thinking about leader of the business, I think one of the challenges that our company had was to not only take care of the present, but also to think about the future. And it's very easy in the middle of a crisis like this, and equally though, interestingly, one that is unfolding slowly, to just think about what do we need to do today. And whether that is, are we protecting our people? Are we keeping our clients safe? Are we protecting the business and achieving our revenue figures or whatever the commercial targets are? But within all that, where is it that you need to pay attention? And for us in particular, we found that not only were we having to cope with a lot of different things, but that also we were midway through a strategy process. And as it now turns out, a brand new CEO. So you mix new strategy, new CEO and pandemic, and that is a very interesting time. And you might almost say, oh, that's so much. How can you cope with all that at the same time? And I think we're incredibly fortunate that we had kicked off that strategy process, because what that allowed us to do was to address some of the issues as they came up. So one of the biggest challenges that we had was the way it impacted a lot of our markets. So we supported the energy business and the oil prices in crisis. We support shipping clients. Clearly, people weren't going on cruise holidays anymore, yet essential commodities need to be moved on the sea. And we support the food sector in many ways, and we support a lot of businesses with their ISO certifications. And in many ways, that compliance and assurance gives those clients a license to operate. So how do you keep supporting clients in that way? And the previous strategy had been very much about digitization, that digital transformation that you spoke about. And we had done things like move to SAP for our business processes and billing. We had put in Office 365. We'd rolled out new laptops. In one way, you kind of think, well, that's pretty much part of business as usual, isn't it? But if we hadn't done that, we wouldn't have been able to distribute 6,000 people around the globe working remotely and keeping the business functioning to support the clients I've just mentioned. Equally, part of our innovation and being a more digital company, we'd started to say, how do you go and survey a ship? How do you go and do an inspection of a crane? How do you go and assess food remotely? What is different if you don't have to send somebody to do it? And it was really just beyond the kind of MVP, minimum viable product stage, but it was good enough. And we were able to deploy a lot of our work and keep going, keep those clients going through using those remote solutions. The thing that I kind of think about is we never wrote on our risk register, what do we do if there's a global pandemic? There was nothing like that on our risk register. And we have thought about doing those things in the sense of we need to modernize, we need to be more customer focused, we need to be more digital. We hadn't said, how could we ever work remotely? Yet it turned out that all those great activities that we'd done and the money that we'd invested in that previous year set us up to be more resilient in the future. And I think it's a really interesting dimension to resilience. We wouldn't have talked about it that way, but that is exactly what it had given us. So there's that element of resilience. I think just briefly, perhaps jumping onto just talking about leader of people and teams. As I said, we started remote working, and that's great. And everybody around the globe and companies are talking about, isn't it great? Everybody can work remotely. We can keep going. Nobody needs to commute anymore. But I think we're missing what is missing by remote working. How can you lead people when sometimes you can't see them? How can you lead people when the only time that you see them is on a Zoom call or a Teams call or whatever platform you're using? And often it's very task-focused in that relationship. And so we miss the thinking about the team. I go back to Sandhurst days and we used to have a leadership model, I remember there. It's well ingrained in my memory by somebody called John Adair of the centered leadership model. And he talks about the team, the task, and the individual as three overlapping circles in a Venn diagram. So I think the task, as I said, you can look at focus, but team, how do you run a team when you're not together? And then also some of the other benefits that spontaneity of being together is when often innovation happens, the great idea happens, you solve the problem because you bump into somebody at the coffee machine that you didn't know you were going to talk to in that moment. And I think that is one of the things I've really noticed. And so I wonder by everybody working remotely, where will we miss that creativity? And so where is that opportunity for transformation that's still to come there? So I think being a connected leader is really important as well in that respect. And then perhaps just very briefly, leader of self. I think in this new way, you can be really focused on what you've got to do. You can get up in the morning, sit down, stare at the computer screen, have a whole back-to-back series of meetings and keep working on late into the night. But what is that doing for you as a leader, and how does that impact your decision-making? And so how are you taking care of yourself as a leader? And how are you authentic in that way as well? So I'm a big believer of a big reader of Thrive by Arianna Huffington. And when I read that, I thought, I know I'm going to see what happens if you try and get 8 hours sleep every night. And I've been doing that for the last 7 years, and it's really transformed how I work, how I think. My stress levels plummeted. I'd like to say I show up better for my team. I'd like to think I make better decisions. So where's that exercise, that mindfulness, whatever it is as a leader? And so I think I'm just thinking a bit more about that. And I think that then allows you to show up as your best version of yourself, as an authentic leader. So you put all that big mix together, really, of how each of us shows up as individuals. And I think showing up in the right way, and then you've got the environment you're working in, that allows people to be their real best. And that's when you get, those really good ideas for transformation happening, or indeed difficult things that you've got to do. What are you going to leave behind? I think that's the other great opportunity, is not everything needs to continue. We can fix forward. We don't just need to fix backwards.
Thank you, Elaine. I think that's very powerful, looking at those 3 levels and making sure that just as a prerequisite for any of that you're showing up as your best self and that you're taking care of self. Let me turn it over to you, Craig, to share with us what does that look like in the midst of a city?
No, thanks, Lauren, and it's good to be here with old friends from GRCN and Resilience Shift, and thank you for inviting me in the World Bank. I think what changed for me in this particular crisis is I became far more self-conscious of what I do and how I do it in my organization as a leader. And I say that because I do occupy a leadership role according to our organization chart and my titles, but it's something different to actually exercise leadership and exercise leadership in great uncertainty. And so I very deliberately thought about what does it mean to direct, what does it mean to structure things in a time where you don't know all of the answers, but people are looking for someone to help them navigate that complexity. And so I think for me personally, it was a far more conscious journey of always checking myself and thinking about what I am doing as a leader in the organization and how I'm navigating or suggesting the navigation of COVID-19. And I say that because, in other big programs or projects that I've worked on, or in my day-to-day life in the operations of the city, I'll always think about what's the project performance, what's the financial performance, how am I communicating with my stakeholders or change? But the far more, I think, sometimes abstract ideal of what it means to be an effective leader has never really been so prominently on my checklist of things that I had to register for myself every day. And I was very fortunate that, my organization placed a lot of trust in myself and the team that I led. But what was critical was, in as much as I had to show, some sense of direction, it also had to be very much on the understanding that I was leading a leadership coalition. The city is too big for one person, no matter how effective they may be, to bring every vested interest in the city organization with you. And you can only do that by deliberate construction and design. And our approach to COVID-19 with the team that I led thought about this question of what is the mechanism for leading the city approach? What does it look like in leadership terms? What does responsibility and authority and accountability mean? And we thoroughly debated those questions. And I think for me, building that coalition and realizing that leadership and its attributes have to be distributed around such a complex organization and so big an organization, without divesting yourself of the fact that in uncertainty, someone or some team must give direction. So I had to search for that balance, and I think I managed to find it. And this exercise that we're talking about now was just so powerful in assisting me on that journey, because there is something so wonderfully precise about the fact that once a week, every week, Peter was going to call me and open with a couple of words, and then, you know, something would just come pouring out of me, and he would have, you know, very well thought out follow-up questions. But that engagement forced me to reflect and forced me to have a constant feedback mechanism as a leader. And that's something that I think we're going to take forward in the organization, and I'll talk about that a little later. And then finally, in sort of management terms, you know, very much with what Elaine had been saying, we have also quite a big organization. It's 31,000 employees. And we had this distinction in our version of the lockdown of essential services city workers and those who support them in professional or management capacities, making sure that those essential services operated throughout COVID. We took around 8,000 people into remote working, and we did it in a space of around 72 hours because of these investments, similarly, that we made in digitally enabling our organization. And actually at the time, serendipitously, in one of the other functional roles that I hold, which is in the IT domain, I'd been trying to motivate for a project to assist the city in its technological evolution and updating many of our legacy systems. And some of the policy and budgeting decisions came up at the time of COVID. And, well, that became like pushing at an open door to say, you know, I didn't have to sell it very hard to talk about the fact that the future of the city business is online and it's digital. And we had that approved, and I think we are completing that journey now in what we're calling our Future of Work program. That is the driving force for updating our approach to management, and not just in the tools we give people and how we work, but what we expect from people as well, especially learning from the incredible emotional and mental stress that this period has meant for all of our city employees. Thanks.
Obviously, some deep reflection really on what does it mean to be an effective leader, to direct people in a time of such uncertainty. And I really like your words about the need to balance between consulting people while still giving a sense of direction, and then you also your reflection, the link back to your weekly conversation with Peter. I want to turn to Elaine, but of course, I want to invite anybody to jump in this conversation. Kind of coming back to this weekly conversation with Peter. Elaine, you said that it heightened your sense. It didn't really change your leadership style, but it heightened your sense of responsibility, a stronger sense of awareness, a stronger sense of focus. That you realize your role as a leader, not just of a business, but in a way of a community and of yourself, different dimension. Reflecting on this, do you think that this process should be something that actually should be mainstreamed, maybe with the leadership of most private private companies? Do you think it's a process that is useful overall, not just in time of such large crisis? There's a lot of discussion about the value of leadership training. What are your views on that?
I agree. I've been really candid. And I think Peter and Seth know this, so I hope they won't take offense. Initially, it was, Elaine would like you to join this panel. I think you'd be great. And I was sort of, what am I going to fit that in? Here's kind of another thing to do, which is perhaps indicative we all feel like that. I have to tell you, after about 3 sessions, it was almost like therapy. And it was just like, I cannot wait to have those 30 minutes with Peter. And I think that's because you pause. And I think this is a really important thing, as much as perhaps reflection. It's that you pause. I read a great book the other day called Do Pause, and just think about it that way. So it meant for 30 minutes every week, there would be a time when I could let all of the day job go. I could let anything go. And Peter and I would have a fascinating conversation, which, exactly as he said, was not structured, went in many different directions. Things that we would range from would, of course, be aligned with the objectives of the programme that Seth outlined. But we might find ourselves discussing how is your government responding to this versus other governments. Or we might find ourselves looking for how the press were covering it and what the response of the press was, and whether they were doing a good job or a bad job. And I just think, for me, having that 30 minutes and that unstructured conversation means that new pathways connect in your brain. Dots join in different ways that they wouldn't have joined normally. You probably have a very linear thought process in your day-to-day work. But here was something that wasn't even circular. It's probably a very, a big scrawly mess if you tried to draw where it went. Wonderful, wonderfully rich in that. And therefore, not only did it give me time to reflect, and I think there was a high degree, personally, of introspection in that, and things that I was doing that I wasn't even conscious I was doing sometimes. And that's probably why I articulate what I did before, because I did have that introspection. But at the same time, having that space and that opportunity for your brain to rethink things in a different way, reframe them if you like, or to see a different perspective from the one you'd been looking at before. I think that meant I went back into the day job, into work, into whichever of those facets I talked about, but particularly perhaps going back into the leader of the business. It almost felt like my brain had expanded, and as if I had this sort of extra vision and I could see broader horizons. I mean, that might sound a bit sort of grandiose to say that, but that was my experience of going back in. It was as if my brain had been to the gym, and had a really good workout. And so I think you do need to take time to reflect. I think doing it, one of the other unique aspects of the program was that we did do it real time. Because again, and then you saw what you'd said a week later, you saw what your cohort had said, and you thought, did I really say that? And by the time you get 6 weeks in, you think, was that really what was going on? What was I thinking about? What was I feeling 6 weeks? And so it kind of took you on a journey as we went through. And so I think many management teams, will have away days. They'll have strategy away days. They'll have team building away days, and we all go away and we make good intentions and we write some objectives up. And then we kind of come back and crack on with it, do it the way we've already done it. So I think there is something incredibly powerful in this process of that continued repetition of that time. 30 minutes in a week, we can find 30 minutes to do that. And I was probably thinking about where else had I seen things like this. Not quite the same, but I've noticed if you watch sports people and commentators asking them after the match, what did you think? How did you play? Now, more and more, we hear them say, well, we'll watch that in the video after. I'll notice what happened afterwards. And that's a little bit, I think, like the military used to have this thing called an after-action review, whereas when something's happened, you go and review. And I think this is the important thing of the reflection. Clearly, the act itself is very helpful in the moment. but how are you learning from it and putting those lessons in place? And I think when often you end up, as I said, with a workshop for a day and you end up with a checklist, it's easy to forget. There's a lot here, I think, about almost continual improvement in doing it. You learned something, we can change that tomorrow. Now let's move on, and now we can change that tomorrow. And so you get this transformational change. Happen to be a cycling fan, and I hope I don't offend anybody on the call. With the way that the British cycling team or Team Sky performed for a while, but Dave Brailsford's motto was those incremental improvements. And I think that's, again, a way sometimes you don't realise something's transformed if you're doing a little bit every day. And that small change adds up to massive change versus let's have a big initiative. So I think there's something really powerful in what we did and something to learn. Although when I think about it myself, in the many years I've kind of worked in these environments, I think this is the first time I've ever been in something like this. The only thing close to it before has ever been something called appreciative inquiry, when you talk about what was good, not what was bad. So yes, I think we should do a lot more of it.
So clearly, 30 minutes a week, clearly worth it. Peter, should we call this the Peter effect? Do you think it's a you, or are there elements that you think that general rule, like the value of doing this real time, the need to pause? What's the secret of allowing this conversation to proceed? You said you had no script; it was just getting into the conversation every week. How did you get to open the conversation, right? When someone arrives and is stressed from the day, imagine, Elaine, that you must have been really stressed in the first few sessions, getting there and then certainly having to face this. I don't know if you knew Peter before, but it must not be that easy to certainly starting talking about leadership issues with someone you've never met, even if it's someone you probably will, who's 1,000 miles away. But Peter, what are your reflections on this?
Very good question, Francis. My first reflection is that you have to be genuinely interested in other people in general. I mean, that's a trivial thing to say, but it's a very good example to take, Elaine, because we hadn't met before, and I knew through Seth, or one of Seth's colleagues, who said to me, we're having a bit of problem because Elaine's not sure she has time to do this. So that was a signal to me that she was not 100% bought into this project. And remember, I was still working it out as well. So, and I remember in those early first conversation or two with Elaine, I mainly just and found a way to ask to what might be relevant for the next question and so on. Whereas by the end, we were really sharing perspectives, and Elaine was really interested to know what I thought about X or Y. And it was much more like a conversation, whereas at the beginning, in a way, it was more like therapy in the beginning, where I was genuinely trying to find out how to listen to this person in a way that would draw her out and allow her to feel that she could really think out loud in my presence. And it just occurs to me, as you were framing that question, Francis, that we actually are in the middle of a culture globally, I think, with the exception of some indigenous cultures, I would say, of very rapid communication, where the emphasis is primarily on getting your message across. And compared with our ancient ancestors, who would have had masses of time to listen to other people's stories and were never in a hurry, because what was the hurry? There was nowhere to go in a hurry, no plane to catch and so on. And I think we have it latent in our genetically coded in our cells, is the ability to find real pleasure in slowing down and listening to another. So I don't think what I did was a special gift that well, Peter could do it, but no way I could. I don't think it's like that at all. But it may take a little bit of uncovering because culturally it's been buried for many of us. Many big organizations, I don't think there's much kudos for listening, unless you're listening upwards to a boss so that the boss thinks you're really attentive to what they're saying.
Could I step in there, Peter, because I think there's listening, but I think there's actually being heard. And I remember somebody once telling me about this tribe, and when you meet somebody, you shake hands and you look deeply into their eyes, and you don't let go of their hand until you say, I see you, and then the other person waits till they're ready and they say, I see you. And I think one of the most powerful things was that it didn't just feel that I was being listened to, but I felt that I was being heard. And I think it's a subtle difference, but really important, and something that I think that's what people need, because that builds the empathy as well into the process.
Yeah, that's a lovely example.
Yeah, I was going to chip in with a similar comment, because I totally agree that the listening and also being heard is a lost art. But aside from that broader kind of social commentary, the other interesting thing is crisis management. And when you're in crisis management, you don't have time for self-reflection and to listen. It's all about incident command. It's all about chain of command. It's all about the fluidity with which you're moving information. It's very different than listening and hearing. At least that's been my personal experience. And it's very hard to bring those into other kind of venues or practices. And I think the question you asked, Francis, is really interesting. How or when does this get incorporated into daily activities in the company? Well, some companies do that, but most don't. And to Elaine's point, it does happen maybe in a standalone workshop, but organizations aren't necessarily incentivized, or isn't their business focus to look at, on a daily basis, emergency response management, crisis management. But what's interesting is a lot of businesses do care deeply about business continuity. And increasingly, the level of uncertainty that we're facing, regardless of whether it's a pandemic, an onslaught of extreme weather, digital transformation, what have you, that uncertainty is there. And I think companies do need to start thinking much more deeply about it. And it's interesting because, again, my experience in cities appreciate or grasp this a little bit better. They do often and frequently kind of jurisdictional planning processes, departmental processes, again, more static, not as continual, but that there is a little bit more of a tradition in there. But again, it's not for listening. And I think that was what was profound about this exercise for me. And that old adage, no one is as smart as everyone. And I think whether you're a practitioner of whatever degree in this space, you have some experiences to rely on, you have some opinions and beliefs, but to hear 12 people from very different contexts have very similar, and it's, yes, dissimilar, but very similar thoughts in real time was very actually empowering for someone like me in terms of what I thought, what I heard, whether that was my opinion, whether that was a global perception, and or how it was manifesting itself differently. And it was fascinating from that perspective, because I think one of the great takeaways from all of this is that you need to hold multiple truths simultaneous. And that's a weird and a hard thing to grapple with. So just picking up on the conversations and the anecdotes that Craig and Elaine were sharing, as a leader, you need to show confidence, stability, but at the same time, in a moment like this, which was so unsettling and so disturbing, and one of the things we heard really powerfully back from Femke and some of the others who are on our team, who are younger and actually producing all of this content, one of the things that they echoed back and that we heard from everybody else was the ability to see vulnerability. And Peter was just mentioning this conversations with Elaine, getting Elaine feeling comfortable to be heard and to talk. And leadership isn't, it's all fine, we've got it all figured out, when really everybody knows you're frantically scrambling in war rooms trying to get it done. And actually messaging that back to your team, to your staff, to your family is really helpful, because they're kind of freaking out and they're looking, well, he doesn't look too worried. She doesn't look too worried. Am I just losing it? Maybe I shouldn't be that worried. No, we're all losing it. But where is that balance of stability and authority with vulnerability and uncertainty? Where does that come in? And that's a different type of authority and leadership that I think is a little weak right now, and it needs to be bolstered.
And you
to that, and then maybe come back to how you create that space. That's following up on that point. And I want to ask two questions about the process and direct them first to Craig, because you are probably the only person who is involved in this project for whom this was not actually your first time to have a crisis hit and to invoke a reflective learning process, because the city was faced with drought 2017, 2018, and had engaged in reflective learning. So in terms of that process, what kind of value could you see in convening the type of process that you did that was focused first on a very Cape Town focused audience and then having a global process? Do you see that this is something that other cities should, and to Francis's point, that they could replicate in meaningful ways with the right intention?
I absolutely think it can be replicated in other cities, and you're right. I mean, it's only a few years ago we were dealing with the drought, and you know, one of the reflections from the drought of how we came into the pandemic was that this was not the first time that the city was dealing in recent times with existential crisis. And we were fortunate that many of the people involved in the drought response were also involved in the COVID response. And, we had kept the mechanisms that we learned from the drought active and built on them so that we could be more resilient to shocks and stresses in the future. And Elaine mentioned, no pandemic on the risk register, neither did we, but we did have an approach of, scanning the horizon for risks and what we might have to respond to. And as early as January, Gareth Morgan, well known to the GRCN, came to me and said, there's something emerging with COVID-19 and we need to get prepared for it. And that spun up a lot of learning and memory from the drought. And part of that was a structured memory exercise that we went through with Peter post-drought. Where a whole lot of us got together and poured our hearts out of what we remembered about the drought, and that goes beyond what is archival to, your mental archive. And we realized, initiating COVID-19, that in fact we were going to do something that was going to be in lifetime during our management of COVID-19. Building on everything else that we had entrenched with resilience thinking in the organization, one of them was conscious leadership in crisis and constant iterative learning. And so we were actually in the midst of setting up our own project before this one was started of a similar reflective learning exercise. And in fact, it was carried out for the duration of our crisis management response. And the lessons that were generated from that project and this are actively going into our leadership development programs for city executives and city managers and professional staffs. It is already fed back into it. We've already had a webinar focusing on this between Peter and Gareth, who've spoken about this at length. And it's part of our structured leadership programs that we've invested in over the past 18 months. And I think that if you don't do that, you risk this becoming an academic exercise. And so you have to figure out, it has value, it has real value in helping develop your leaders, but there is also a knowledge component that is so valuable as well. Just going through the transcripts of my interviews with Peter, there is material there that will inform our response, whomever the leader is who deals with it, to the next existential crisis that hits Cape Town. Hopefully, there'll be a bigger length of time between the next one and this current one, not like the drought and COVID. But it really is about being deliberate, and it is in fact going to inform our response to crisis management and truly citywide emergencies that affect Cape Town. We have already got exercises that are almost at completion that will go into our leadership and management structures of what did we learn now and how do we readapt and learn. And I would really urge all cities to engage in a similar process.
And just quickly, I know there's an interesting question in the chat, and I would like to get to that, or maybe Francis wants to get to that in a minute. But Craig, that process that you described, is that one that is published that the City of Cape Town shares via its website or other places?
We haven't published it at the moment, but we can certainly think about packaging it and sharing it for other organizations. So absolutely, yes.
Wonderful.
Lauren, I see the time. Go ahead. Who's this?
Sorry, on that last point, it just struck me to say that the standing back at the end of our 16-week project, what was really striking was that although in every single conversation that I had every week, I was never chasing down a leadership insight. Like I wasn't going in there as a hunter to try and see if I can get 2 leadership insights out of Elaine or Craig today and add them to the pile. Just having that conversation with someone who is actually leading and in the moment, we accumulated this extraordinary pile of genuine insights expressed in almost sort of casual passing thought by these individual leaders, which in my experience is very different from an expert sitting to write a book and say, now what are the 10 best things a leader must do in a crisis? Just comes from a different part of the brain. So it's like the wisdom is a byproduct rather than something you go in with a laser focus to grab.
Peter, that's actually a perfect segue of the question I wanted to ask, which is you've said you've come up with 37 insights. As we're closing this session, unfortunately, there's never enough time for this session, but what would be the top 3, or can you, I'm sure there's no priority amongst them, but what are the top 3 that would come to the top of your head?
Okay.
And yeah.
I'm gonna just busk here. So the first one actually was triggered by something that Seth said at the beginning, which is pre-existing conditions. It became so clear, particularly this is in the first few weeks, that that the state that your institutions and your systems and your teams and your own self are in prior to the beginning of the crisis will determine how well they can cope. There is not much you can do when the crisis hits. Okay, in a long-running crisis like this, there is time to make adjustments. But basically, the amount of trust you've got with your teams, with your citizens or your employees, that's basically given. So the message, the wisdom out of that is invest in the infrastructure of resilience within your organization beforehand, because when the crisis comes, you'll be so glad of every little bit that's on the plus side of that ledger. And oh gosh, Seth, help me here. My mind has just gone a unhelpful blank.
I would say we're actually at the top of the hour.
Yes,
You may be saved by the bell, in fact, Peter, because I know we want to keep on time here. Let me just take this moment to thank all of the speakers for their participation tonight, to Elaine, to Craig, to Peter, to Seth. It's really been such a pleasure to have you on and to have you sharing the insights, which again are on the website that Peter shared in the beginning of this session. And I wanted to remind everyone, we have 2 more sessions before the end of the year, Cities on the Frontline. We have the 26th of November is our next session, and we'll be focusing on climate change governance with Rotterdam and with Chennai, and also very likely with Glasgow, who would have been at this special time of year the host of COP26, were it not for COVID-19. So we hope to see you back here next week.
And Lauren, if I could, I just wanted to thank you all, not just for hosting the session, but both your organizations stepped up in that 2-week time frame that Peter mentioned. The World Bank, Global Resilient Cities Network, and we came together in an unbelievably short amount of time to put this together. And that underlying condition of trust and support and creativity and a potential failure of experimentation was what this was grounded in. So massive thank you for the collaboration, the insight, and the trust in all of this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the partnership.
Bye, guys.
Good night, everyone from Singapore, and have a great afternoon and day in the rest of the world.